My name is Jack Marino Chin, and I grew up believing I was a Christian. I went through very difficult situations as a child, which left me confused and with a lot of repressed emotions. Later on, I had a supernatural experience with what I initially thought were angels, but I eventually began to understand as something else. This became a way to escape the struggles I was living through and a means to find an identity, diving into experiences that went beyond everyday reality. This led me to seek more forms of escape, such as substance use and engaging in self-destructive behaviors. I also became involved in very toxic and harmful relationships. It was in this context that I was introduced to New Age ideology. In high school, I read the book, The Secret, which opened my eyes to the law of attraction. The idea that I could control my reality was incredibly appealing to me. However, another problematic relationship pushed me even further down this path. When everything fell apart, I realized I was alone and needed to gain control over my life. From that point, I started to believe I was being influenced by external forces, which led me to engage in practices within an esoteric order called Golden Dawn, where we performed rituals. It was in this dark environment that Jesus Christ found me and saved me. Today, I have been sober for almost 7 years and am married. My life has changed in an incredible way, and I never imagined I could smile or feel happy again after everything I went through. The Lord has completely redeemed my life. I used to think we were Christians simply because we were Americans. I attended a Methodist school as a child, but I don't remember hearing the gospel clearly. I was too young to understand it. My idea of Jesus was of a protective figure I imagined during moments of fear. I didn't really understand what it meant to be a Christian, but I believed I was. When I was very young, I went through experiences that deeply marked me, ones I couldn't process at the time. Over time, I tried to repress those memories, but the pain and fear were still there. Those difficult moments made me believe in many things, including the idea that I could create a different reality, as if life were a fairy tale. This became my way of coping with what was happening. At 7 years old, I began seeing lights in the sky, which I felt were powerful and welcoming presences. At first, I thought they were angels, but as I learned about other phenomena, I began associating these experiences with something beyond what I knew. At that time, I believed these entities accepted me and understood what I was going through. I remember looking at a canyon, and somehow it's hard to put into words, but I felt a powerful presence, something extremely intense. It was almost like an out-of-body experience. For a long time, this experience became my identity because it made me feel special and unique to these presences. From then on, I continued having similar experiences and found myself increasingly fascinated by the concept of aliens. I began to feel different from other people, and gradually, I started to drift away from things I knew were wrong. The abuse I experienced in childhood caused a lot of confusion inside me. I began to connect with friends who, as I later discovered, were going through similar experiences. We would share stories and secrets, which created a heavy burden of guilt, shame, and anger, emotions I repressed. These powerful, though confusing experiences became a way to escape and to have something to believe in and hope for. With the little I knew about Christianity, I started to reject that perspective and embraced a new one, where these extraterrestrial beings were the key to feeling accepted and believing I was special to them. This took on a profound meaning for me in a world where I felt invisible and misunderstood. I didn't have access to the internet at first, but once I did, I began searching for information. I read a lot about UFOs and the Greys, those classic alien figures, and that made me feel even more connected to the experiences I had. It was a way to try to understand and give meaning to what was happening to me. A family member, who was also deeply influenced by the idea of UFOs, was the one who got me to start seeing things that way. It was like a switch flipped, a realization that the idea of angels felt too vague and lacked context for me, while the concept of aliens visiting Earth with all its mysterious allure made much more sense and fascinated me. I truly believed I was special to these entities, so I started seeking more of these experiences. I even made my own Ouija board, all in an attempt to establish more contact with these beings, whom I believed were my friends. Other people had imaginary friends, but for me, these entities were real. They saw me, understood me, and loved me, and that gave me a sense of belonging I couldn't find anywhere else. During my teenage years, I kept trying to escape from myself. I developed an eating disorder in the 8th grade and got involved in self-destructive behaviors. I was completely lost. By the time I reached high school, I desperately wanted to fit in, but somehow, I kept making these things my way of seeking identity. I didn't know who I was, and more importantly, I didn't know who God was. I didn't understand that even in the pain of abuse and the confusion I was going through, there was a good God I could turn to. Jesus wasn't just some distant idea. He was the perfect Savior who went to the cross, took upon himself the weight of God's wrath, and bore my sin. He rose again and is now at the right hand of God as the only mediator between God and man. I didn't know that. I thought there was no one I could turn to. I was afraid of people finding out who I really was, so these entities became my way of coping with it all. I realized that if I didn't start doing what my friends were doing, I would lose those friendships. That's how alcohol and substances became part of my life, because I thought that if I didn't join in, I wouldn't be accepted in that group anymore. This took me even further down a path of confusion and farther from who I was truly meant to be. I forgot to mention that my father, who was very close to my mother, separated from her when I was 5 years old because he had addictions to methamphetamines and alcohol. That made it unsafe for us to stay with him, so the separation was very hard for me. I went through a lot of turbulence and confusion about who I was, who my caregiver was, and who really cared about me. I was trying to figure out my identity. It makes sense to me that such a young child, as I was at 7 years old at the time, would cling to something she felt was a greater force, something stable that saw her as special, because that's how I wanted to feel. I wanted to be seen without having to tell the people around me because of the guilt I felt, as if it were something I was carrying. When I was younger, I had a certain apprehension. Often, it felt like these entities were coming to me, but I wasn't actively trying to communicate with them. However, by the time I reached high school and started adopting these New Age beliefs, without even knowing that's what I was doing, I read the book The Secret and began to understand the law of attraction. Wow, the universe is so vast. This really makes sense with what I've experienced, I thought. I immersed myself in it and started applying these ideas to my life. Later, I entered a very confusing relationship where this person taught me that we live hundreds of lives and that we are all the same being in different forms, just on separate journeys. He said that in some lives we were sent on different missions, but deep down, we were the same person. This happened toward the end of my teenage years. This was a very painful relationship, but at the same time, my exposure to New Age ideologies led me to start using specific substances, like psychedelics, with the goal of communicating with these entities. I was using these substances to enter altered states of consciousness. Additionally, I began using binaural beats, different frequencies that claim to help induce these altered states, almost like a form of deep meditation. For me, this was incredibly appealing because it was a much more intense way to escape from myself. It was a far more powerful escape. It felt like a way to give meaning to my pain, to deal with the confusion in a way that somehow made me feel like I was in control, or that I could control what was happening inside me. Shame was a huge part of who I was. I felt so much shame and guilt. And there was immense confusion about what was true, about my sexual orientation, about what was just desire and what was real. I felt like I didn't understand anything about sexuality. This led to a distorted understanding of who I was and what was healthy. Combined with everything else going on in my life, it created a deep confusion about what it really meant to be me. I went through several friendships, and in all of them, I just wanted to make sure no one found out what had happened. No one could know about the abuse I had endured. There was so much shame tied to it. I had one friendship where the person, whom I saw as a friend, started to develop feelings for me. it was a girl. And that terrified me, because if that came out, it wouldn't just expose this situation, but everything I had lived through. I feared people truly seeing who I was, and that was terrifying. The confusion about my sexuality and who I was as a person consumed me. I was being fed a kind of false gospel without realizing it at the time through these entities. It was a message that I was special, that I had a purpose, and that I could be free because there was a plan for me. That idea was incredibly attractive and exciting, which is why I identified with it so strongly. I read The Secret in high school, and this was before that tumultuous relationship with the guy I believed to be my twin flame. That relationship was yet another abusive context. The book essentially said you could make your dreams come true, that your thoughts create your reality, and that you have the power to create the life you want. It said you are the most important being in the universe, capable of manifesting any life you desire. The book was marketed in a very palatable way, without seeming occultist or new age. It felt more like a self-help, personal empowerment idea, something very positive. Looking back now, I realize that on the cover, there's a reference to the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, something I didn't understand at the time, but that later connected to the path I followed. That book pushed me even further into the occult, into pure darkness, even though it was presented in a very bright and appealing way, like a girl boss concept. You can create your own life. It was seductive to me. The most interesting part is that when things didn't work out, it was your fault because you must have thought something negative at some point. So, it became this cycle of guilt and bondage, but the idea of freedom seemed incredible. I didn't like my life. There were good parts, but overall I wasn't happy. The idea of transforming my life into something I wanted felt liberating. I believed I had the power to be my own goddess and create the reality I desired. This reminds me of the story in Genesis, where the promise of eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil was that Eve would gain divine power, something that would set her free. But, as we know, it ultimately led to bondage. The idea of twin flames is that there's an internal flame between you and this other person, something that was always destined to happen. It's an eternal connection, and as I mentioned, we've lived many lives. Even though in some of them we were on separate missions, in the end, we were the same essence. This concept that, even though I was in a relationship with someone else, this wasn't the one, and that the real connection was with this twin flame, made me believe that when we finally met, it would be inevitable. Almost as if an external, transcendental force was pulling us together. It felt like a spiritual bond. That's how it was explained to me, and I truly believed it. Deep down, I made this man my God. He became my religion. He taught me about New Age ideologies, and I believed we were one. The first time I saw him, I felt that same familiar sensation I had when I saw those entities. It was a deep connection in a world full of darkness and pain, where he appeared as someone vibrant, with answers, with beautiful things to say, things I'd never heard before. I completely threw myself into that relationship and ended up becoming nothing more than his follower. It was with him that I started experimenting with psychedelic substances and going to New Age festivals, similar to Burning Man but on a smaller scale. At these events, I began learning more about sexual liberation, polyamory, and various other New Age ideas and practices, like charging my crystals under the moonlight. Once again, I didn't know who I was, but I found my identity in this new belief system that promised me the power to create my own reality. In the end, I was serving this person to pay my karma and bring us closer together. My best memories with him, the ones that didn't involve violence, were of staying up all night, using substances on the reservation, talking about aliens, ancestors, the elements, and all sorts of things I was learning from him. And the most striking part is that even in the midst of all of this, I still claimed to be a Christian. Despite the substance abuse, the alcohol, living for myself, and being caught in sin, I still thought of myself as a Christian because I didn't really know what that meant. And if someone confronted me, I would say, "You can't judge my heart. You don't know me." But in reality, I never knew Christ. And the little truth I did know, I gradually abandoned to embrace these new ideas, like believing it was wrong not to accept the Native American worldview because they might have been the first here, or starting to think that everything was valid as long as I looked at it differently. I would say that the occult is the root of the New Age. If you follow New Age ideologies, you will inevitably come across the occult. When the relationship with the guy I believed to be my twin flame ended, it was devastating. I had given myself entirely to him, and I felt like my identity was completely tied to him. I had just moved to Hollywood and rented an apartment to be closer to him when I got the news that it was over, but he told me he would come back to me, and it was as if the relationship had ended spiritually, as if it was just a temporary separation because, as twin flames, we were destined to reunite. It was so confusing, both spiritually and physically. He told me he would come back to me, but that I needed to make something of myself. He told me to keep using substances while I waited, so the time would pass more quickly. And I genuinely believed those things. When I got married, to be honest, it was very hard to take that step because I still carried this lie I had believed for years. He's going to come back to me. It was complicated because the twin flame concept I had, created by Satan, was so deeply rooted in me. It kept me in a kind of mental slavery. When that relationship ended, it was a huge shock. I was already very involved, but that breakup hit me hard. At the time, my dad was living on the streets of Los Angeles, and when it rained, I felt completely crushed thinking about him because I felt like I was responsible for him. There was so much pain, and it felt like nothing was working. But by God's grace, while I was immersed in the New Age and attending these festivals, I began to sense that something was wrong, especially when I participated in some very dark experiences. At the festivals, there were Tantra yoga tents and even orgies that promoted the idea of sexual liberation and freedom. But something inside me wouldn't let me go all the way. Something held me back. And that bothered me a lot because I thought my Christian perspective was what was stopping me from being truly free. I felt frustrated that I couldn't be who I thought I should be, or who my twin flame wanted me to be, or who I thought I could be if I fit into these groups. When the relationship ended, I thought, I need to free myself, suppress all of this, and find true power because manifesting my reality wasn't working. That's when I started locking myself in my apartment, using substances, and dedicating myself completely to the pursuit of this secret knowledge. I truly believed that these entities wanted to see through my eyes. I didn't think of it as possession, but believed that these entities, which had been with me since childhood, wanted to use my body to see the world. And I felt like that made me special. Looking back, it seems so obvious that it was something bad. But at the time, it felt like the next logical step on a path I had been walking for so long. I even felt like the entities were really seeing through my eyes, especially during moments of meditation. Sometimes I felt more connected to them. But as I delved deeper, I started noticing something very strange. I remember looking into my own eyes in the mirror and feeling a chill run down my spine, a deep fear, because I didn't recognize what was behind my eyes. It wasn't me anymore. Even so, I thought I needed to go deeper into the darkness and shine the light of knowledge, as I had been taught. Despite the fear, I continued down that path. I also started channeling. I would write things like, I am an alien seeing through the eyes of a girl, and other very dark things. I was becoming more lost, sinking deeper into this depravity. What led me to the occult was a strange progression. It was as if, with every new step, everything around me began to physically glow. I was so out of touch with myself, so disoriented, that I couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. I would walk past places, and things would start glowing. One day, I was walking down the street and saw a Masonic lodge, which seemed to shine. That pulled me even further into Masonic and Kabbalistic texts. I didn't know much about Freemasonry or what these texts were, but at that moment, everything seemed to make sense. Freemasonry is a secret society with roots in occultism and esoteric rituals. Masonic and Kabbalistic texts are writings that deal with esotericism, magic, and hidden knowledge of the universe. They teach the pursuit of power and wisdom through rituals and teachings that are often not revealed to everyone, only to those initiated into these paths. These texts are highly influential in various occult traditions and are seen as a way to achieve higher knowledge that promises power and control over reality. When it comes to Freemasonry, I often face a lot of resistance when I talk about it because Freemasonry is a male-centered fraternity. However, it has other orders, and that's how I ended up getting connected. When I contacted a Masonic lodge, they referred me to the Eastern Star, which is the order for women and also involves secret teachings. The order I eventually became involved with, called the Golden Dawn, was founded by 3 Master Masons and incorporated many Masonic ideas and symbols. Freemasonry is very ritualistic and theatrical, and the Golden Dawn also brought in influences from Rosicrucianism, which is an esoteric philosophy. I heard that what the Rosicrucians believe and practice is something the Golden Dawn adopted as part of its esoteric path. I was drawn to the Golden Dawn after seeing a tarot deck that seemed to glow. That deck turned out to be the Thoth Tarot, created by a man named Aleister Crowley, who is known as the most wicked man to have ever lived. He was responsible for popularizing many occult practices in the United States. Aleister Crowley popularized several truly grotesque practices, many related to sexual magic, believing that bodily fluids held superior magical power. The practice of sexual magic was one of the most distorted, and he took it to a very horrific extreme, including child abuse. Truly terrible things that are said about him. He brought these practices to the United States, or at least was the one who most widely spread this ideology. He was also featured on the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album and was heavily promoted by the music industry at the time. I was in a metaphysical shop when I saw them. The tarot cards started glowing, and I felt like these entities were guiding me, showing me the path to follow, telling me what to buy, what to focus on. When I saw a Masonic lodge glowing, I felt it was the path I was meant to take. And in fact, everything seemed to fall into place, as if each piece fit perfectly, leading me to the Golden Dawn. That's how it all happened. I bought the cards, and as I became more and more involved with these practices, I began to immerse myself in this world of magic and the occult. The idea of having access to secret knowledge was deeply appealing to me, and everything seemed to make sense at the time. But looking back now, I can see how everything was aligned to pull me away from what was good, from what was true. I spent almost all my time trying to absorb the imagery, really trying to imprint that tarot deck into my mind. I started dreaming about the cards and practicing tarot with that deck. It was through these cards and the teachings of Aleister Crowley that I was truly introduced to the Golden Dawn. Crowley had been a member of the original Golden Dawn, and I felt like this was the next step for me. I started believing that everything was leading me there. I really thought that if he was the most evil man to have ever lived, I had to justify what was good and what was bad. I kept trying to rationalize it, telling myself that I would join the Eastern Star, a Masonic-affiliated order, because I had family members involved, and it seemed like a good thing. But their symbol is an inverted pentagram, so I knew that wasn't good. On the other hand, the Golden Dawn had a cross in its symbol, so I thought that must mean it was good. It took some time, going back and forth, before I finally got in touch with an order in Los Angeles, where I was living at the time. The original Golden Dawn ended a long time ago, but there were people who continued practicing the same magic. I reached out to them, and a man asked me to meet him at a cafe in Silver Lake. When we started talking, everything he said felt exactly like what I had already been led to believe, based on astrology, Kabbalah, Egyptian gods, tarot, everything I had been studying. It was like he was speaking my language, and I thought, wow, I can finally talk to someone who understands this. I was genuinely excited. He used phrases like, "You've been called to this," and it felt like I was about to join a secret club that my alien entities, who I believed were my friends, had been preparing me for. What caught my attention the most was the way he spoke so deeply and esoterically about the great work. I had already been practicing alchemy, which is also tied to the great work. He talked about the magical work of transmutation, where raw matter is transformed into gold. But more symbolically, it was about the transmutation of the soul, rising from a lower state to become gold. It was like a demonic sanctification, if I can put it that way. To me, it felt like every previous step, even the mistakes, the substances I had used, the paintings in my apartment, all of it had led me to this moment. I felt it was divine providence, as if it were destiny, as if everything was part of a larger plan. I was invited to go to a Masonic lodge to be initiated, and I was very excited. I remember that on the way there, I was listening to the Phantasmic soundtrack because I felt that all the witchcraft and Disney themes finally made sense to me. I thought I was about to experience all of that in real life. And honestly, I wasn't scared. I was thrilled. When I arrived, there was a woman waiting on the staircase, dressed in a black cloak with a hood. That didn't scare me. It made sense, considering everything I had studied and been involved in. At that time, I wasn't working, except for doing some occasional gigs like deliveries, and I was being financially supported by my family. All of my time was obsessively dedicated to studying these things, so it all felt very natural. I was taken to a room, put on a black robe, wore red socks, and was instructed not to pray but to meditate to prepare for the ritual. The ritual itself was very dark, and I was blind for most of it, meaning I couldn't see anything. It was all very dark, and the ritual involved a distorted interpretation of John 15, with the idea of stepping into darkness to illuminate with the light of secret knowledge. There was a lot of symbolism tied to duality, light and darkness, and ancient Egyptian hermeticism. During the ritual, they placed a sword against my neck and made me swear never to share what I had learned. It was very frightening. At the time, I didn't find it scary. I thought it was something sacred, serious, and I had already experienced similar situations with theatrical rituals in other contexts. I remember telling someone that I wasn't afraid because I had gone through something like this before. To me, it all made sense. There was a weight to it, a sense that it was sacred, but at the same time it was very heavy. I felt very special to be there, believing I had been called to it. I kept going to the Masonic Lodge to practice and learn. There were days we stayed up to 12 hours performing invocation rituals, creating sigils, and learning hermetic magic, and I would still say I was a Christian. That's incredible, because I truly believed I was drawing closer to Christ when, in reality, I was worshiping demons and becoming more depraved, both sexually and in many other ways. My understanding of sexual identity was also becoming distorted. I got involved with sex magic, which taught that the peak of sexual pleasure is the most powerful moment to manifest desires. It was essentially the law of attraction, but with an even more perverse focus. The teaching claimed that orgasm gave greater access to the supernatural and made manifestation more effective. I didn't participate in rituals with other people, but practiced alone. The idea was that sexual energy, especially orgasm, was the most powerful moment to manifest desires. I was very sick from substance abuse, and as a result, I didn't have a menstrual cycle. But I wanted one so badly because menstrual blood is considered very powerful for magical practices. When I think about rituals like those involving abortion, or any practice that uses blood as a magical tool, it makes sense to me now in light of the lies I believed back then. It's so painful to realize that now, because once you dive into the occult, you see how the belief system around blood, sexuality, duality, and fluidity is completely distorted. And looking at today's culture, I'm not surprised by what I see. I remember seeing a post by Cosmopolitan on Instagram last year talking about abortion as a satanic ritual. That really shocked me because we've even seen the Satanic Temple trying to include exemptions in pro-life laws, claiming that, for religious freedom, they should be allowed to perform sacrifices of unborn babies as part of their religion. It's truly terrifying, but for those immersed in that kind of belief, these practices seem to make sense within the value system they've been taught. This doesn't surprise me because they see blood as something powerful, as well as the sacrifice of children. I never witnessed that myself, but it was something I learned about and believed in, more as a philosophy. I didn't see it being practiced, but if I had, I probably would have accepted it. Thank God I was saved before that. At the time, I believed it was something good. I thought that using my own blood for magical practices, or simply using my body autonomously, was a powerful and divine act. This concept of female empowerment and self-empowerment was very aligned with the idea of becoming a god. It reminds me so much of the subversion of what Jesus taught. Jesus shed his blood and gave his body as the ultimate and perfect sacrifice to cover our sin, while the occult teaches that you need to shed your own blood and offer your body as a sacrifice to any deity to gain the power to become your own god. This idea is behind so much of what we hear today, even outside the occult, especially in spaces focused on female empowerment. These are successful, beautiful, and wealthy women in great relationships. And even if they don't say these words directly, the message is the same. You can achieve whatever you want by loving yourself, being the leader of your own life, being your own goddess, and following your heart. The idea is that if you love yourself enough, you will unlock inner powers to manifest the good things you want in your life. Now, I see a parallel between this and mainstream culture. Knowing where it all originates from is truly disturbing because it all goes back to Genesis 3, the lie that you can be your own god. To me, this reflects the idea that by learning good and evil, your eyes will be opened and you will become like God. This belief diminishes Jesus, strips away his divinity, and completely distorts the truth about who he is. Instead, it promotes self-empowerment. Whether it's with your own blood or someone else's, it takes power away from the Bible, which exists to teach us the truth. During the Masonic rituals, we used the Bible, but in a distorted way. For example, we used Psalm 51, but in Latin, or incorporated Kabbalah and Gematria, which assign numerical values to Hebrew letters. The Bible became a source of secret knowledge, and we performed banishing rituals, invoking God's names, such as the Hebrew names of God, and even recited the Lord's Prayer for occult rituals. We tried to set up the ritual space similarly to the tabernacle, as a way of siphoning power from the Bible. The goal was to carry out our own will, believing there was power in it, but it was a total distortion, a way of trying to become gods, which is the essence of Luciferianism. We believed that by using the Bible and learning God's Hebrew names, we were closer to Christ, but in reality, we were twisting everything. I would call myself a Christian, talk about Jesus and the Bible, but my definitions of those terms and the way I practiced were entirely opposed to what God teaches. Christ consciousness is a concept often found in New Age beliefs, but the idea behind it is that Christ reached a level of consciousness that you can also achieve. The premise is that just as Christ was, you can also be, if you reach that level and ascend to that power. This often connects to the idea of awakening your inner power, something found in many modern spiritual practices, where it's believed you can become like Christ without recognizing his divinity and sacrifice. And at the time, I truly believed I was reaching the peak of my evolution, thinking I could be like Christ or even a god. But that was a complete lie, and it could never save me. I was sinking deeper and deeper into darkness. I also saw people who claimed to be Christians but used language like Christ consciousness or becoming Christ. Not in the sense of becoming like him, but in taking on the mind of Christ, which in practice meant becoming a small god, reaching the highest level of humanity, or even transcending it. I thought that was true enlightenment, but I was drifting further and further away from God. I was deeply involved in all of it. It was my life. But then I started having moments of realization about how depraved I was becoming. I remember one moment when I looked in the mirror and heard a voice say, "It's crazy how evil becomes a part of you." That voice wasn't mine, and it was deeply unsettling, to say the least. I started thinking that maybe what I was doing was truly evil, but at the same time, I believed I could make things right later. I thought there was a difference between doing something wrong and being bad. But in that moment, I realized how much worse I was becoming. I was constantly doing wrong things, and it was far more serious than I'd imagined. I was involved in practices that used the Bible, but I had also read the Bhagavad Gita, a Hindu text, and I thought that if I could read that, the Bible was no different. It was just another sacred text. Then I read the passage in Matthew 7 that says, "You will recognize a tree by its fruit." I didn't fully understand what it meant, but it felt like it pierced through me. Or the fruit of the people in the order, including myself, was as depraved as mine. They were addicted to simple things like cigarettes, which made me question, if they could control the universe, why were they addicted to cigarettes? That gave me pause. I realized these people were just as broken as I was, which made me reflect even more. Additionally, I read 2 Corinthians 11:14, which says that Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. I kept thinking, how can this be bad? This is a work of light. But when I read that verse, I finally realized that Satan was behind all of it. I had already started to feel that what I was doing was wrong, but I was still too proud to walk away. However, one night I remembered Genesis 3 and the lie in Eden. "If you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." It was at that moment I realized, Satan is behind this, and it led me to the fall. I knew I was about to fall, but I still didn't know who I was outside of this. This was all I had ever known, so I continued. One night, I was in my apartment, and a spiritual attack happened. I fell to my knees and felt as if my soul was being sucked into complete darkness, with no control over it. That's when I cried out, "Jesus Christ, save me," and I truly meant it, from the depths of my heart. At that moment, I suddenly felt an immense peace, a peace I had been searching for my entire life, and I knew it was the God of the Bible, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, who saved me and delivered me from that attack. I realized that for him, it wasn't hard to free me from all the darkness I was in, a darkness I thought I could never escape. I was trembling, because if the God of the Bible is real, and he is, then what I had been doing, all those practices like witchcraft, divination, and more, was abominable. That terrified me, so I grabbed the Bible and began to read, still thinking I had some sort of secret knowledge. But as I read, I felt like I was being filled, as if I was truly eating from the Word. Unlike everything else I had read before, which only left me emptier and hungrier, now I felt satisfied. I knew I was being fed by the truth. I had always been learning, but never coming to the knowledge of the truth. But with the Word of God, it was different. I felt satisfied, kept reading, and realized that God is holy. I hadn't understood that before. I thought God was like me, and that I could be God. But he gave me everything good I had ever received, and yet I had sinned against this holy God. It became clear to me that I had sinned against God, and that there is a just punishment for sin. I began to feel an overwhelming fear, a reverence, but I also learned that the punishment for sin is just, and that there is a real place called hell. At the same time, I learned that God is love, and that he sent Jesus Christ, not me or someone I could become. It was Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, who came to earth, lived a perfect life, something I clearly had not done, even though he was tempted as I was, and went to the cross, despising the shame, being beaten, mocked, ridiculed, and crucified. He died on that cross, and there he bore my sin, as my sin, the sin of bowing before idols of gold and living the way I had been living. He took upon himself the wrath of God for it, died, and rose again, being the only mediator between God and man. And when I read that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father except through him, I realized I had tried so many other ways, all of which had failed. But when I repented of my sin and turned to God, putting my faith in Christ for my salvation, I knew I could be cleansed, washed white as snow. This reality was shocking to me because I knew how dirty I was. Being transformed into a new creation in Christ was something beyond my comprehension. And so I kept reading, diving deeper into the Word. I would lock myself in my room, and for the first time, I realized I could be sober. I had believed I would die as an addict, but I found freedom. The Lord was with me, spoke to me through his word, and I could run to him in prayer. Since then, I've followed Christ and have been in awe of who God truly is. He is infinitely better than I could have ever imagined. I could never save myself, could never lift myself up by my own strength, but God truly saved me and gave me a new life in him. He has healed me of so many things. I was spiritually starving. I had been reading the Word for some time and listening to sermons, but I still hadn't taken the step to find a church. At the time, I was living in Hollywood, right in the center of the city, and the closest church to me was a Methodist church. I thought all churches were more or less the same, so I decided to go. The pastor there was a woman, and she spent the entire time talking about how they were going to include more LGBTQ people in the church and fight for those causes. It felt more like a social justice meeting, like a town hall meeting, and I was spiritually starving, so it left me very confused. I had walked there with great difficulty, and when I was met with that, I felt so lost. But thank God, I found another church, a very small church plant, and the pastor and his wife welcomed me with incredible patience. They guided me through the scriptures and patiently explained the doctrines to me, which was essential for my spiritual growth. It was a tremendous learning experience. The Lord used that church and their patience to help me grow. I met my husband at church. We had both moved from California around the same time, and we started playing on the worship team together. Our story is actually pretty funny, filled with a lot of friendship and some awkward situations. But God has been using his love for him and the selfless way he serves me in such amazing ways. My husband has been a huge instrument of God in my life, always pointing me to the scriptures and washing me with the word. God has taught me so much about what love is, especially romantic love, through my husband. He has been a tool of sanctification for me, considering everything I went through before, like childhood abuse, abusive relationships, and a life of sin. I came into this relationship carrying so much baggage, and God has been so kind in using this marriage to show me his character and his design for love between a man and a woman. I feel so blessed and grateful to walk this journey by his side. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here sharing my story. I am confident that it will encourage many people. May God bless you all. After everything you've heard, I want to ask you a question. What is governing your life? Are you searching for answers in the wrong places? Or are you ready to discover the true peace that only Jesus can offer? Maybe you're struggling with doubts, fears, or trying to find your purpose. What will your next step be? God is powerful enough to transform any life, no matter how lost it may seem. There is no darkness so deep that the love of Christ cannot reach it. Could today be the day you allow him to transform your story too? Share in the comments what spoke to you the most from this testimony. I'd love to hear how God is working in your life. And if this message impacted you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep learning more about living a life transformed by Jesus Christ. Here, there will always be space to grow, reflect, and find the true freedom that only he can offer. See you in the next video, and may God bless you abundantly.
I joined a gang at a very young age, between 12 and 13 years old. I had a tough life. Chicago wasn't an easy place to grow up. Unfortunately, I followed that path. The years went by, and I ended up dominating, so to speak, street life. So, the years passed, and I put a lot of trust in my family from the gang. I really considered them my family. However, I ended up discovering that they betrayed me. They set me up to be killed. I had a weird feeling about him. When I looked at him, he smiled, a malicious smile, as if to say, "I got you." It was such an evil smile. I only remember that everything seemed to move in slow motion, and I fell backwards. But this kind of darkness isn't the same as we see here on Earth. This darkness is alive. As I was falling, I knew I was going to hell. And then I heard the screams of people. And what struck me were the creatures that were there. They were the most grotesque demons you can imagine. Hollywood can't even come close to what these things really looked like. They were deformed, with twisted legs and arms, reptilian in appearance, and their eyes glowed yellow or red. Some of them were over 13 feet tall.
If you felt moved by this testimony and want to watch this story and more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Here, we share powerful experiences that can transform lives and strengthen faith. Click the subscribe button, activate the notification bell to receive updates, and join our community of faith and hope.